When it comes to the ancient woodlands focus, I mean, obviously there's a sentimentality that you say, we want to hold on to things that have been around for hundreds of years, of course. But why is it that ancient woodland is particularly important?
It's probably our richest terrestrial habitat in terms of wildlife. So one aged oak tree can have about 350 species on it. I mean, it really is incredibly rich as a habitat. So if you're worried about wildlife and what's happening to wildlife in this country, and we know that globally we're facing mass extinction on a scale we've never seen before, then you have to be worried about ancient woodland because it's such a strong habitat for so much of our wildlife. But it's also really important to us culturally as well and historically. So most of our ancient woodlands, you walk into them now as a way of going somewhere peaceful and filtered light and wonderful birdsong and so on. And they are all of that now. But they were also huge places of work in the past. So, you will often find lots and lots of archaeological remains where those woods would have been worked hard. And so they're a huge link to our past. If you think about just about place names in the UK, so many of them have a woodland connotation or a tree connotation. My own surname, Speight, is Middle English and it means woodpecker.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think it still means woodpecker in modern German, actually. We're absolutely tied to woodland in this country, and so it's a really important part of where we all come from as well. And increasingly, we know now that there are huge health and mental well-being benefits from being somewhere like a beautiful piece of woodland. And if you have in your mind's eye a place where there are fantastic bluebells, where you've seen wildlife, where the trees are there are some fantastic old trees in particular, that's a piece of ancient woodland. And it's increasingly fragmented. So obviously it's shrunk in terms of total size, but it's also often in small pockets dotted about the landscape now. So one of the things we always try and do is think about how we can protect those remaining ancient woodland places and join them up a bit more as well for wildlife.
I mean, I know that the overall totals of forestation in Europe, it's an increasing number because areas are being reforested. But then, of course, what's being reforested, I guess, is often pine forests rather than old. And I know there's more to it than that.
Yeah.
So I know there's good and there's bad in all these things. But how long does it take, if you're replanting forests where you're planting indigenous trees, how long is it before you're starting to get back to something of the richness that the ancient woodlands have got?
Oh, hundreds of years.
Years.
Yeah. If you go to a newly planted piece of woodland, in about 5 to 10 years, depending on the soil and climate and so on, what went in as 2-foot-high whips will be trees that are coming up to your shoulder and perhaps above your head in some cases. Things like birch get away very fast.
Yeah.
But in order to develop the understory of an ancient woodland and to start developing the kind of ecosystem that I talked about, that takes hundreds of years, if not thousands. So that's why this idea that you can somehow lose a piece of ancient woodland and plant a few new trees somewhere else in compensation is such a bad idea. I mean, ancient woodland is by definition irreplaceable. So, you're never going to get to that huge continuous kind of ecosystem woodland cover situation.
Yes. So what are the main threats to the ancient woodland in our time now? Where is it being nibbled away and why?
It has, up until now, been nibbled away by really inappropriate uses. So things like paintballing or small modern housing development going in, or stuff where actually you could put that somewhere else very easily.
Yes.
And we were successful last year in getting something called the National Planning Policy Framework. So this is the document that governs the way in which planning decisions are made, changed so that ancient woodland is now on a par with our most important listed buildings in terms of saying you cannot do something on this piece of land unless it's wholly exceptional, is the wording. And that's been a big win for us, and we're now making sure that it's getting implemented appropriately by local authorities across the country, and that's in England. But the big threats coming through now are things like infrastructure. So HS2 has been a long-running battle for us.
Yes, this is the super-fast rail.
Yes, and making sure that the infrastructure, and there's a huge spend that came through in the last budget around roads, for example, is planned and done in a way that absolutely respects the environment and respects ancient woodland in particular. So that's where I see a lot of damage coming through. And of course, Climate change. Climate change is impacting on our ancient woodlands. So thinking again about the resilience of our treescapes is really important in the face of climate change.
So what are the main impacts that we're seeing at this stage from the changes that we've experienced already with the ancient woodlands that we have?
Tree disease is a big thing. If you think about disease like cholera, ash dieback, that's having a big impact on our ash trees at the moment. We don't really know yet quite how devastating it's going to be, but it seems as though it's going to be pretty devastating. So it's interesting last summer watching the ash trees go through leaf burst, which they go through fairly late in the spring, and seeing thinner canopy cover, which is a real sign of many things, but can be ash dieback. So pests and diseases are a big thing coming through. So warmer, wetter winters means that something that's fungal probably doesn't get killed off as much as it might have done. Increasing globalisation, for example, shifting lots of stuff around the world in wooden packing crates with bits of bark left on them where a beetle can lurk and then come into this country is a big issue. We know from our own Nature's Calendar work, which is a way in which we look at what significant ecological events are happening at what time each year and look at the changes, we can see that spring is moving around and things are getting out of sync. Something that depends on a particular insect for its food, for example, nesting at a time when that insect is less available, that kind of stuff is going on. So there's a sense in which the climate is really having an impact in terms of our natural world.
And how do we track the differences in that? Because of course the British climate has always been variable and it's always done some fairly extraordinary things, and obviously we know where the trends are. We're beyond the nonsense of saying, oh, but the weather always changes. But because of that variability, how do we start to get a sense of how this is going to play out over the next 20 to 50 years, where you're going to have to think seriously about what sort of adaptation is possible in the face of this? Woodlands that have been a certain way for so long.
Yeah, so our thinking at the moment is that in terms of our core aims, which are wildlife habitat and the broader benefits of trees for people, we think that our native species can probably cope. As long as we're making sure that woods are resilient, and by that I mean they have a varied age structure and a good mix of species, we think those woods will probably cope. If you were a commercial timber grower, you might be feeling differently about that. And there are certainly commercial timber growers who are talking about starting to plant new species and planting species that are better adjusted to a warmer climate. So it depends on where you're standing, really. But from our perspective, we think our native species will adapt, will cope. And we think those are also the species that have obviously evolved alongside our wildlife, so that's an important relationship to try and keep going. But we may change our minds. That's what we think at the moment.
Because at the end of the day, you've got to keep seeing what's happening in practice and work out what it means. Ultimately, changes are happening. Obviously, we're all working as hard as we can to minimise those changes, but one thing that's quite clear is that we're on a path of change and working out what the consequences of that are and how it can
I find it deeply, deeply personally shocking to think back to my childhood when I was growing up in Dorset sort of 40 years ago, and just thinking about the kind of wildlife and insect life that I saw around me day in, day out, which just isn't there.
Yes.
It's gone.
And there's been quite a lot of narrative the last couple of years, I think, just people observing the memories of their days out in the car in their youth, where you then had this splattered windscreen full of all sorts of insects.
The windscreen splatter, yeah.
And of course now, the first time I heard that, I thought, actually, that almost never happens anymore. Almost never happens.
And believe me, that's not just something that wildlife enthusiasts or slightly odd people who like to look at lots of bugs down microscopes should be worried about. This is something we should all be worried about. These are pollinators, many of them, that are making sure that the crops that we need to survive as a species are able to be grown and feed us. So these are fundamental issues that we're now having to face into. We talked about the impact of climate change on trees and woods. Trees can also be hopefully part of the mitigation, which I hope we'll come and talk about as well. But these are huge issues facing us, and we absolutely, as the UK, as the world, we have to wake up to this and face into it and do some stuff fast. Otherwise, we're going to be in big, big, big trouble.